Well, of course, political will
Yeah.
is the first, and it's a consistent problem. Because there's fear around that.
Fear on both sides.
Yeah, on both sides.
Yeah.
Because then what do you replace it with?
Right.
How much are you going to, how much you being the federal government, or whatever, whoever is leading the federal government at the time, has that concern about, well, how much do we let the Indigenous people in, and how much control will they have over policies and regulations and all those sorts of things, and is there room for that, right? The other concern is the Indigenous communities defining for themselves what it is they want in order to better have that relationship and the role that they were playing within Canada. That's going to be another big issue, I think.
Because
Very.
just as an extenuation of that, within the Indigenous communities, you have relatively wealthy Indigenous communities that have access to resources, develop those resources, share the resources. Then you have the isolated communities with few resources that are poor.
Mm-hmm.
And they rely on that Indian Act a great deal. And so there's that schism within the Indigenous communities. The wealthy communities want to get out from under it. These isolated, poor communities depend on that Indian Act. And how do you envision that coming together?
Well, I think a lot of the isolated communities don't have the economic wherewithal because they're isolated communities, first and foremost, and that's going to be an issue that needs to be overcome, right? A way of addressing those issues, particularly with the have-nots, just like what we do here with provinces, right? We make sure we put something aside for the others who don't have much, and that's very much an Indigenous thought. It's a real human-centered approach at doing anything. We always put a little aside to make sure that people who don't have enough will get enough, right? And, we also have to know that the Indian Act doesn't provide all that much amount of money to First Nations people. And this is what drives me crazy, is that I'm always hearing people saying, well, we give you $8 billion a year, we give you $8 billion a year. And, and so you're basically riding on the backs of my taxes. But in fact, when all is pulled together, we're looking at about Indigenous people paying well into, $10, $11 billion in taxes of their own. So in fact, they're paying their own way into it. Now, the traditional territories, when they're developed, what's supposed to happen, and what's supposed to have happened, is that there's supposed to be a residual from any extraction that comes out from any traditional territory. For every oil rig that's put in there, a certain cost of that, as defined by the development agreement, is supposed to go into the communities. Little Buffalo, for example, this is an old number in the news, but they're looking at $600 million, every 3 months is pulled out of their traditional territories, and they don't receive anything. They're the poorest reserve in Canada, right? They're supposed to receive that because their livelihood is directly undermined. So that's how we can address those sorts of issues. But also, First Nations Indigenous communities have different kinds of leaders at different times. And prosperity isn't always happening on one particular reserve. And I could just look at other reserves around here who at one time had billions of dollars. That's not there anymore. So it can be temporary. Okay. We'll start there and then we'll just go on. Okay. Go ahead.
You were saying that Minister...
Let's
Bennett.
speak louder, please.
Sorry. You were saying that the Minister of Indian Affairs, it's just still not happening that you have control. So what's going to take to change that?
Well, I think, there has to be a change to the legislation that's happening now. Those controls have to be removed. They do. And it has to be put back into the hands of the First Nations. So it's an act, it's a legislative change, a policy change. They brought in these more harsher terms through the Harper government with the omnibus bill. back when we were all protesting the omnibus bill back then, but that's what was hidden for us in there. That was that little gift that he keeps telling you about. And it is something that is still there, so that has to be questioned. I mean, I don't think Carolyn Bennett is going to exercise that kind of authority. However, there's always the possibility that someone will. If it is there, it is a tool to be used. And the way that politics and economies work, it's interesting what people will do. The kindness of people will do if they have the tool to do it. So we got to remove that possibility by legislation. That's how it has to be done. First and foremost, retract what was put in. Secondly, create new legislation designed by Indigenous people within the context of the Canadian government. I think is the other answer.
Is that going to happen during her reign? And she seems to be doing what she can, but...
Well, I think it can happen. I do. I'm an optimist. You know, you grow up in despair. You know, optimism is your only out. So, I believe. I really do believe that it can happen. And that's if we keep moving in the same direction, but with our allies as well. And you are our allies. And so we need the help to do it. In the late 60s, the early 70s, the Indigenous movement protected the treaty rights, but we didn't do it alone. So we're going to face the same kind of strategy to deal with it.
Well, my question comment is sort of related to that, actually. I'm asking on a more kind of personal level, sort of for so many like movements where, you know, there's a minority rights issue or whatever, you kind of need enough of the majority to get fired up and on board to start to see a shift in whatever the problem is, right? And I want to know if you, in the last few years, as this TRC thing has been going through and finished, do you feel that shift in the environment from the lay people, from your daily encounters? Because I, even myself, find as this has been going on, I've confronted my own little biases and little things going in my head, minor things even like that. My sudden discomfort with the name Edmonton Eskimos, little things like that where I'm going, okay, all these little, my own biases, I'm confronting them and finding myself shifting as this whole process goes through. Do you feel that as an Indigenous person living here?
I think the more hope that I get is the more knowledge the mainstream society retains. And I think when you have that, it can change very much the politics of your time and the politicians that you have. So that becomes a hopeful sign that, yeah, things are going to change, but also it's how would you say, it's very delicate as well. Because all you need is a couple bad stories in the media of corrupt Indigenous people in one form or another, you name it, to twist that around. And it becomes a public relations game as well. And the media is complicit in a lot of these images that it creates. So that's the other part that needs to be addressed as well. But hopefully, yes, I feel that it's a hopeful sign.
Bonjour, Dante. Thank you, Lewis. Great presentation. Sometimes I think when we have talks like this are so vital, so important in our communities. But sometimes I think as I look around the table, if we're not preaching to the converted, but it's still great that this conversation happens. I appreciated you bringing up the two-row wampum. And sometimes, and I'm Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes, Ontario, and so I like that metaphor of the canoe and the ship. I've only been here a few years, and grateful that when I ran in the last election, Lewis was my mentor and helped me immensely. And I have to honestly say, coming from the East, I really had some stereotypical thoughts about what Alberta, more so Edmonton, and I did hear some racist comments, and I didn't take it to heart. I just chuckled and thought, it's true what they say about Edmontonians. But I campaigned and I door knocked, and maybe I knocked on your door, and I met amazing people. And like Lewis says, I was raised in despair, but I'm optimistic. I'm completely optimistic. And as I work on my dissertation, I think about making that canoe stronger and better, but I want to stay in that canoe. And I know the ship is on the other side, and maybe I'll wander over there and go on a cruise. But I'm really fine with my maple syrup in my canoe. And so, but what I wanted to speak about is, what was tapped on is we heard get rid of the Indian Act. What I heard and what I really appreciated was the sunset comment. The legislation has to be in place. So we're not marching to get rid of the Indian Act. Legislation has to be in place prior, and by us. And I'm very grateful Wab Canoe and some of the others are now politically active and sitting at that table. My dad, who used to put on a suit in 1964 when he became a Canadian citizen and could vote, sprayed himself with his Old Spice and proudly went to go and vote. And I'm a child of the late 60s, early 70s civil rights era, singing the AIM song, arguing and debating with my dad, no, don't go and vote because it's not our government. And I was singing the AIM song, trying to have our own Indigenous rights many years later to realize my dad was so ahead of his time and realized no, when he said, my girl, we need to be sitting at that table. And so your support of us sitting at that table is, so that legislation has to happen. So we don't hear the banner or see the banner that just says, get rid of the Indian Act. We need to be creating that legislation. Miigwech.
Okay.
It's been in my mind for a number of times, and I've argued it with myself. What would happen if all of the agents in the Canadian government were Indians and were elected from the Indian community to administer the act and change the act suitably? And then I think to myself, you know, there's as much difference among the Indian communities as there are among the Canadian communities. Would that only result in another riot of confusion? But it does seem to me that the Indian Act should be administered by Indians.
Yeah. Well, it should, yeah, that's the delicate question, right? We already have a lot of the Indigenous people within the Ministry of Indian Affairs. There's over 10,000 employees that work for the Ministry of Indian Affairs, yeah. And you know that $8 billion is talking about? That includes the cost of running that department, right? So the illusion that Indigenous people are getting all this money is simply false. Maybe 20% might reach the front lines. The rest gets sucked up in contracts and disbursement payments, and I can go on forever about that. But there are Indigenous people there. My Uncle Harold, for example, was the first regional director of Indian Affairs here in Alberta back in 1974, 75. And his experience, as limited as amount of knowledge I had with it, in order to make the changes he wanted to make, he was attacked politically by both the government itself and the Indigenous community as well. Because you will be damned if you're going to stop the gravy train, right? So, you know, that's a brass tax bill. Thanks for bringing that up.
I have just one really question, and I'm concerned about the properties and how are you going to reestablish and get all the properties? And you know, it's come up again in Eastern Canada, how the properties, how you're going to get those. Now, I'm an Albertan. I'm born in Arrowwood, Alberta, just south of Siksika Nation. And you know that was called Blackfoot Indian Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is, I was conceived, born, raised, and I've lived in Alberta all those years. But I just wonder, they sold a lot of their properties, the various reserves sold properties to the earth because they were appeared that they couldn't manage the thing and they couldn't look after it. How are you going to do that? Or are you going to do that all over? Because it must be a lot more properties that they sold, and the idea is it's rightly theirs. So how are you gonna do that?
Okay, well, there's an investigation that needs to be done. There's a lot of things that are called land claims that are in the courts right now. There's a lot of them. Because Indigenous people are raising the issues of the legitimacy of the sale of land, one of which is Papa's Chase right here. You know, was it legitimate?
Which
You know, the Papa's Chase First Nation, southern Edmonton, pretty much. From actually 122nd Street to 17th and from 51st Avenue to Ellerslie was the Papa's Chase First Nation. Anyway, the questions of the legitimacy of it being sold is still a point of contention. But that's just one. I mean, there's other First Nations that have lands that were illegally sold. The Indian agent was saying, listen, I'm going to sell 600 acres to my partner over here. You know, I mean, the whole history of...
And there was far more of that
Mhm.
than somebody who's managing.
Yeah, and there were some Indigenous leaders who decided at their time that that was a good thing to do, but it wasn't by far anywhere near, a majority.
But there must be a lot of properties all over this land.
Yes, absolutely. If we're going to really seek reconciliation, that's a part of the restitution that needs to take place.
Just wanted to know, that's-
Yeah, it's a good question, though.
Here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cardinal, for this presentation. I've got lots of thoughts. I'm going to try and remain sort of making sense. First of all, I'm Canadian, but first generation Italian. Born and raised in Montreal. My first language is Italian, then I learned French, then I learned English. And I've been in Alberta for 30 years, and I claim Alberta to be my home. But when you talk about residential schools and stripping the Aboriginal people of their identity, of their heart, of their soul, I can relate minutely, because when I've gone back to Italy, my heart is in Italy.
Yeah.
When I'm in Quebec, my heart is in Quebec. When I'm here, my heart is here. So, the human being is torn in terms of identity, and it's so important to get a sense of who we are. I love when you mention, I really like when you say that to resolve this whole issue of superiority or feeling less than, I think the answer lies in chartering a new course completely. There's all the treaties, the land claims, of course that's important, but I think our society is we're all new Canadians. The only authentic Canadians or Canadians are Aboriginal people. So I think that to resolve it long term is charting a new course, defining who we are, who we all are. And your analogy of, each sort of going down that river in our canoe or our ship, I agree to a certain extent. Because to live in peace and to live harmoniously, and I think we need to travel down that river a little bit in each of nos embarcations, I'll use the word in French. So anyway, there's so much work to be done. I think the residential schools were an atrocity. So many other things have been atrocities. I think racism, discrimination, manipulation from the white who came thinking that they were superior and that they were going to impose language and culture, and that goes on. It's still going on it's still going on today. I think if we can come to a solution by chartering a new course, as you're suggesting, where we live as one, but really celebrating the Aboriginal culture and new Canadians, because all the rest of us are new Canadians, 300 years or a little bit more. I think that might bring us to a place where we all feel that we have our place and we're all living together, as you say, in peace, in respect, and in friendship. And the last thing I'm going to say is, this is a little funny thing. I went to school in French school. The good were the Huron, les Hurons, and the Catholics. And in grade 7, I went to English school, and it switched. But the good were the Iroquois and the Protestant. So now, I don't know if you're aware, the Department of Education is revising its entire curriculum, and calling for people to make suggestions as to what should be included in the curriculum. And I think the truth about Indigenous people in history and setting the record straight is the beginning.
Yes, absolutely. That's wonderful. Yeah, you bring up a really good point. One thing that I didn't say, which I was intimating it perhaps, is that what we are doing with this reconciliation, this whole thing of reconciliation, is we're doing something so unique in the world. There are people taking notice of what we are doing. And just by taking this little step, we have already made some small changes that we will not be able to go back on because we are seeing more of that truth. So when we start really fully moving through and making the changes that we're suggesting, or the things that we'll discover, it's fundamentally changing what Canada is. Canada is going to become this even more amazing place than it is already.
Thanks for the great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I resonated with a lot of what you said. It's a delicate situation that we're in, and honestly, I'm terrified, especially seeing what's going on in the States and seeing that sort of political ideology is recurrent, and history repeats itself, and it can. And I'm scared for that to happen here. So these sort of forums and these sort of talks are really productive, and I think they're essential. But how do we reach out? How do we get the majority? How do we capture and captivate people that need to have this talk, that should want to have this talk? How do we motivate that movement? Because we have to be in the majority to make a change, and like the political system has to totally overhaul in order for these legislations to go through. And so, like, how do we move forward? And how can we? And how long is this going to take?
How long it's going to take is anyone's guess, but public relations is an amazing thing. It's a very powerful tool. You can change public opinion by having a strategy of what message we want to get out. And I think that's a large responsibility for our leadership to determine how this message, what are we saying, in order to change and touch the hearts of people. I live by an adage that says that if you move the heart, the mind will follow. And I think that's true in most of anything when you work in public relations and PR stuff, that sort of thing. It's the story you're going to tell so that people can see themselves in it. It goes back to that very basic thing. But it's also the repetition of the story and the timeliness of the story. So it really helps to move and motivate people to change the way they see, the way they think, and the things that they do if they want to achieve this. And I think it's possible because the opposite is also true. You can take a message and turn it negative and have the population go against you. Oka was an example. Going into the Oka crisis, 70% of Canadians supported the protesters. By the time the military was called in, and just before the military was called in, the federal and provincial government hired PR firms in Toronto to twist the story around. By the time the military came in, 70% of Canadians were against the protesters. And that's real politics. Right? So we have to be wise enough to take lessons from that and create something that's more positive.
And just to pick up on that, the media has a huge responsibility. And you can see in the States where journalists have been threatened with death at trying to publish the truth about what's going on. So, yeah, that's all I can say. I mean, it takes courageous journalists to be publishing the truth, and let's hope that still continues. Lewis, I just have a quick question. I love your metaphor about the canoes going down the river of life in Canada being, of course, a land of rivers. I just wonder if you foresee and envision down the road whether you see two nations, one Aboriginal and the other the
They have their own Language Protection Act, they have their own land base, they have all these other things that are already in place for them to survive as who they choose to be, which is fine. And I think that's a defining feature within Canadian reality. It certainly is. But Indigenous people, from the Indigenous perspective, We had seen that, yeah, we want our canoe and our boat to be side by side. It doesn't mean that you can't come in to our canoe and enjoy the maple syrup and the view, you know. You're welcome, but you're not going to steer it. You're not going to say where we should be going. Likewise, I'm going to come into your flagship and, you know, and relax and enjoy the view as well. But I see it as definitely, well, it's going to be a part because we're talking about treaties. We can't walk away from our treaties. They're sacred covenants, right? We just have to work as diligently as we can to ensure that they're implemented to their fullest, and that's going to be generational work right there.
Hi, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
I've often heard you speak to groups such as this, and you're very well received. My question is, do you ever address groups that are primarily Indigenous? And if that's the case, what sort of reception do you receive when you're bringing up these kinds of issues with those groups?
I do a lot of talking to Indigenous communities all the time. Every single kind, from teachers to communities. I'm just going up to Big Stone, as a matter of fact, doing another consultation with them. So I'm received quite well.
My name's Catherine. I'm a business analyst, and I like pictures before, during, and after change. That's sort of my thing, is change management or management of change. So I like to see what the future vision is in pictures and stories, because that's easy to digest. I'm visual, I guess. Is there a place I can go look where there's been a vision already mapped or drawn, maybe not connecting the dots? We may not know how to get there, but what does utopia look like?
I don't know, I'll let you know when I get there. I think what's important is the process. And I think what I hear you asking is what would be the process for us to get further down the river in order to enjoy the respect, the peace, and the friendship that we're looking for. That is going to be determined by our leaders, by our spiritual leaders as well, in terms of how we move forward. Now, not just the monolithic us being Indigenous, Métis, First Nation, Inuit, but it's going to be into different areas as well. Because some nations, some communities, some areas will want to do things in a different way. That's what's going to make this difficult. There's not going to be one particular roadmap. There might be, directives, like increase education funding or increase, that sort of stuff. That's going to be determined region by region or province by province or even school district by school district, of course. But I think the objective is to be more inclusive. And some people are going to do it better than others, and that's just the way that it's going to be. But there needs to be a higher level leadership directive on how to do these things as well.
With the fairness, I think education and health would be the two things I personally could connect with and support. I think unless we're educated and bringing education into isolated communities and good quality of water and health care, I think that's where I think everything should start, personally.
Yes, I agree. That's a good way to start.
Yeah, I think it's easier than looking at treaties. I think we got to start somewhere where we all agree.
Oh, no, absolutely. But I'm saying there's an importance of treaties that has been often left behind, marginalized, and devalued. If we want to move forward with reconciliation in its fullest intent, those have to be addressed with. Water is critical, and it's something that we're all trying to address right now in our different ways, but I agree with you there.
There are 3 people left to speak, and then I think we will say that's it. And if people want to talk to you later and you're willing to talk with them, we'll go ahead.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry. I was just because treaties have been mentioned so often today, I'm just wondering, are they constraining at all as they are right now? Do they need improvement? I'm just worried that we're only going to look at the treaties as they were written. I'm worried about explicit language and things like that, which I think might be constraining. I don't know.
Well, there's a whole field of study on the spirit and intent of the treaties that has been defined in jurisprudence already. So the widening and the broadening of those things. Now, we're not just talking about, okay, where's my shovel and my twine that was promised 100 years ago, It's changed, those things have changed, and that's the great thing about those treaties, is they are malleable to meet the changes of the day. And why do we know that? Why do legal cases have supported this? Is because the commissioners kept records, written records of what was promised. Self-government, taxes, all these sorts of things is what was already talked about. So the intent was already there, right? And so it's a matter of implementing those. 90% of resource cases in Canada federal courts are decided on behalf of First Nations and Indigenous people. 90%. Now, when we look at that 90%, the majority of them haven't been implemented. They just kind of sit and collect dust. So where's the political will to make those things happen, right?
My name's Hazel. I just want to first respond to the bit that you mentioned earlier on in terms of the rise in suicide rates since the restitution payments. I find that quite alarming, really. It seems to me that in part it's kind of, we're trying to fix something, but we're doing it in creating more dependency, if you like. I'm not sure if that's the reason for it. I'd be interested in your comments on that, but I also wanted to just comment about the lack of trust in the system. If we're going to do the restitution, if we want to do the reconciliation, clearly there has to be trust between the parties. And I think some things have fallen by the way because of the lack of trust. For example, relating to education, I'd be interested in your comments around how to improve access to education for Aboriginal people.
Okay, so the trust is the work in progress. It's going to take a long time to build that trust, but the only way that you get trust is by first of all engaging in a process that is fair and respectful, but also seeing some actual proof in the pudding, so to speak, that there are intents to make these changes. That's where you start to build trust. But also with that then is the process of dialogue. We have to move away from unilateralness. Over-enthusiastic allies sometimes can be more detrimental to the enemies that we're faced with. Because while they really want to protect you, they sometimes can go a little bit too ahead in order to address a particular issue. The way that you address the issue is through dialogue and a process of dialogue. If we're creating legislation or regulations that affect a certain Indigenous community, you better have the Indigenous community there working with you, building consensus. And that's the other part as well, a very, very powerful tool within the Indigenous traditions, consensus. Consensus isn't just a general agreement, but it's a process of education, it's a process of building trust, and then it's a process of agreement and saying that, okay, well, this is what we need to do then. That will take time, and these are new skills that we're all not used to. But from my experience, when you utilize consensus, people don't like to go back to the 50+1 voting tradition, right? Because they're being heard, and they would rather be in governance than government. That's the other part too. Okay.
Sorry, I can't count. There's one more.
All right.
Mine will be a quick comment. We just heard at the fest Charlotte Gray picking in her mind, in her perception as a historian and a journalist, 10 Canadians who should be really honored. So I enjoyed seeing your quote about what Elijah Harper said, and she too recognized that in where Canada is going, this is one individual who we should listen to and remember the hard work that he had done in the Charter.
Yes.
So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
On exactly those notes, the Elijah Harper quote,
Yeah.
reconciliation as we sit together and talk, which we are doing. I'm just wondering, in terms of Edmonton, we mentioned Caucus Chase.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you can share maybe a couple of examples, I don't know, positive or negative, but you're much more connected than we are. Are there a couple examples you give us of where this is happening that we should know about that are
Yes,
good or
absolutely.
bad?
And I think you're asking the question of an update on Kichiaski. Well, Kichiaski is the first cultural and ceremonial land base that any urban city in Canada is building. And that is under the careful guidance and management of Native Counseling Services of Alberta. My job was to get it to that point where a community organization can take responsibility for it and govern it according to a set of principles and values that are established by their council of elders. And so, right now what they've done there, this last fall, I think it was, or last summer, they took down all the buildings that were there. They discovered some buried tanks, gasoline tanks, oil tanks, or drums, or water cisterns, or different sorts of things. And so that stopped everything, because then they had to go back and do other assessments and other tests, and they had to pull those things out, and they had to test the soils and all this. So it pushed it back a whole year. So what's anticipated is next year, next summer, the land will be ready to be utilized for ceremonies like ceremonies and different sorts of gatherings. Not the super intense like sun dances and those sorts of things. That we still want to have in the community. But what we want is a place where Indigenous people can come and pray and do their sweat lodges, have their pipe ceremonies, get married, do different things down there. But also it's a place of learning. So they do envision having an amphitheater down there. They envision having a medicine garden where we can teach young people through school programming or other things about the different medicines that we grow, like sage and sweetgrass and what they mean and that sort of thing. But also it's a place where Edmontonians can also have an opportunity to learn about Indigenous ceremony and some of the basics in terms of what that means. But most importantly, it allows a location in the city where Indigenous people can go to and do some of their basic ceremonies. The biggest problem we have with our population here is a lot of them don't have transportation. And right now, Indigenous people have to leave town in order to pray their traditional way. So we don't have a church, a mosque, a cathedral that we can go to. But the White Mud Valley then becomes our cathedral, where we can go and do our ceremonies. And a person can take a bus down there on a Saturday afternoon when there's a sweat lodge on and participate if they so choose. But it also supports the 60 or so Indigenous organizations that also need space to go to do some of their programming and their healing ceremonies and things as well. So that's where it's at. So look to next summer, and hopefully we'll have a big and grand opening. And the future just walked in. So.
Trying to figure out how to get over here.
This has been wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Lewis.